It was 11,014 on a Saturday morning when my phone lit up with a text from my brother. Grabbed that little black device from your bag, bringing it to show Jess. Looks like some kind of fancy gadget. She's gonna love it. I read it twice, then a third time. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. I was sitting at my kitchen table with half a cup of cold coffee in front of me, still in the gray hoodie I'd slept in, and for about 3 seconds I just stared at the screen like the words might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. They didn't. My brother had gone through my bag, my work bag, the one I never left unattended, the one that sat locked in my bedroom closet every night, and walked out with a field data collection unit assigned to me by the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Criminal Enforcement. It wasn't a gadget. It wasn't a toy. It was a sealed forensic sampling device used in active contamination investigations, valued at just under $90,000, and it currently held unprocessed soil and water sample data from a site we had been building a federal case around for 8 months. The data wasn't backed up yet. The chain of custody documentation was locked inside that unit. If anything happened to it, if it was opened, dropped, reset, connected to the wrong device, the integrity of the entire investigation could collapse. My brother thought it looked cool. I didn't text back, didn't call him screaming, didn't run to my car. I sat there for exactly 1 more second, finished what was left of my coffee, and then opened my contacts and called my supervisor. She picked up on the second ring. I told her everything in under 90 seconds. Missing unit. Brother. No malicious intent, but that didn't matter. Chain of custody broken. Samples potentially compromised. Last known location, my brother's girlfriend's apartment, roughly 4 miles away. There was a pause. Then, I'm calling the field office. You file the internal report. Do not contact him first. I said I understood. I meant it. Before I explain why I didn't just drive over and grab it myself, let me tell you something about how this kind of work operates. When evidence goes missing, even accidentally, even stupidly, you don't retrieve it quietly. You document everything. You report everything. Because if the defense ever found out that an investigator personally retrieved missing evidence without logging it, without witnesses, without proper chain of custody restoration, it would blow the case apart in court. Every sample, every reading, every timestamp would be questioned. 8 months of work. Gone. I had spent my career building cases that actually held up. I wasn't about to unravel one for the sake of avoiding an awkward conversation with my brother, so I filed the report. I answered every question from the field office coordinator with the kind of precision that left no room for interpretation. And then I sat back and let the process move. My brother's name is Nate. He's 28, 3 years younger than me, and he has never once in his entire adult life asked before taking something. Pence, phone chargers, $20 bills from my wallet, the good umbrella, a jacket I'd had since college. He'd borrow them with that easy grin of his and a "you weren't using it" that he delivered like it was actually a reasonable explanation. Our mother thought it was endearing. She called him spontaneous. I called it what it was. Growing up, I was the one who kept her room clean, finished homework on time, and apologized when something went wrong even if it wasn't my fault. Nate was the one who charmed his way past consequences, a detention here, a broken thing there, and watched our parents shake their heads and smile. He was funny. He was easy. He made every room feel lighter when he walked in. I loved him and I was exhausted by him in almost equal measure. He'd never cared much about what I did for work. When I got into environmental enforcement, he said so. "You're like a tree cop?" And laughed at his own joke for too long. When I tried to explain what contamination investigations actually involved, the communities affected, the companies that spent millions hiding what they dumped, he listened for about 45 seconds before checking his phone. He never asked why I kept my work bag locked. Never noticed the equipment tags or the evidence seals. Never wondered why I was careful about which calls I took near him. He just saw a black case that looked interesting and thought, "Jess would think this is cool." My supervisor called back 40 minutes later. The field office had contacted the EPA's Office of Inspector General. A coordinator was being dispatched. My brother hadn't been reached yet. They wanted me present when contact was made, as the responsible party for the unit. I drove to Jess's building with a federal coordinator named Agent Pena, sitting in the passenger seat. He didn't make small talk. I didn't either. Nate answered the door in a t-shirt and basketball shorts with that grin already forming, the one that assumed whatever was happening could be laughed off. It disappeared fast. Agent Pena explained who he was. Explained the unit. Explained what chain of custody meant and what its violation could mean for an active federal investigation. My brother stood in the doorway going very still in the way people do when they realize the ground has shifted under them and they haven't caught up yet. "It's just sitting on the coffee table," he said. "I didn't open it or anything. It looked like a fancy camera or something." "Where's the unit now?" Agent Pena asked. Nate stepped aside. "We went in." The device was on the coffee table exactly where he said it was, next to an open bag of chips and a remote control. Jess was on the couch looking like she wanted to disappear into it. Agent Pena photographed the unit in place, documented its condition, and then walked through the retrieval protocol while I stood near the door with my hands in my jacket pockets and said nothing. Nate kept glancing at me. That look, the one he always used when he wanted me to intervene, to smooth things over, to be the version of his sister who made problems smaller. I looked back at him and gave him nothing. The unit was secured. Agent Pena logged the retrieval. Then he turned to my brother and told him, quietly and very clearly, that he would be receiving formal notice of the incident, and that the EPA's OIG would determine whether any further action was warranted. The case itself would need to undergo an evidence integrity review to assess whether the chain of custody breach had compromised anything. "Further action," Nate repeated. "Like what?" "That depends on the review," Agent Pena said. "I'd recommend you speak with someone before you receive that notice." After Agent Pena stepped out into the hallway, Nate turned to me. "You could have just called me," he said. His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. "You didn't have to bring someone official. I would have given it back." I kept my voice even. "When? What would you have given it back?" I kept my voice even. "When? What would you have given it back?" "After Jess saw it? After the weekend? Tomorrow?" He didn't answer. "Nate, that unit has 8 months of evidence on it. Evidence that belongs to a federal investigation. The moment it left my bag without authorization, I had a legal obligation to report it. That's not a choice I made out of anger. That's the job." He shook his head slowly. "You've always been like this." "Like what?" "Like everything has to go through the official channel, like you can't just handle something like a normal person." I looked at him for a long moment. A normal person doesn't go through their sister's work bag. He didn't say anything after that. I didn't wait for him to. The drive back to my apartment was quiet. Agent Pena made a few notes on his tablet. I watched the city go past the window. I thought about the first time Nate had taken something of mine. I was 12, he was 9, and it was a bracelet our grandmother had given me. He'd taken it to give to a girl he liked at school. Our mother made him apologize and thought that was the end of it. I never got the bracelet back. The evidence integrity review took 6 days. 6 days of waiting to find out if the investigation we had spent most of a year building was still salvageable. I won't pretend I slept well. I won't pretend I wasn't angry in the deep, settled way that doesn't burn hot. It just sits there, heavy and cold, underneath everything else. My mother called on day 2. She'd heard from Nate. "He said you brought a federal agent to his girlfriend's apartment," she said. "He's humiliated, sweetheart. He didn't know." "I know he didn't know," I said. "That doesn't change what happened. He feels terrible." "He should." Silence. "Then, you could have handled this more quietly." I closed my eyes. "Mom, I could have lost my job. I could have lost a federal case. I could have opened myself up to obstruction charges if I'd gone there alone and retrieved it without documentation. I didn't bring an agent to humiliate Nate. I brought an agent because that's the only legal way to restore chain of custody." She was quiet for a moment. "I just think there was a way to keep this in the family." "There isn't," I said. "Not when family walks out with federal evidence." She didn't have a response to that. We said goodbye. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while after she hung up. On day 6, the review came back. The unit's seal had not been broken. The data was intact. The chain of custody documentation could be restored with a detailed incident report and supplemental affidavit. The investigation was still viable. I sat at my desk and let out the breath I'd been holding for almost a week. The formal notice went to Nate 3 days later. He called me before he opened it. "Whatever it says," he started, "I need you to know I'm sorry. I know that probably doesn't mean much right now, but I am. I believed him. I always believed him when he said he was sorry. That was never the problem." "Read the notice," I said, "then we'll talk." The OIG's determination was lighter than it could have been. No criminal referral. A formal reprimand on record tied to the incident report. A mandatory interview. And a requirement, unusual but not unprecedented, to complete a 30-hour environmental compliance education program developed for community offenders in contamination cases. It wasn't jail. It wasn't a fine he couldn't pay. But it was real. It was documented. It would follow him if anything like this ever came up again. He called me after his meeting with the OIG coordinator. 30 hours, he said, about environmental violations, like watching videos and taking tests, and field sessions, I said. Some of it is on-site. You'll see actual remediation work. A beat. That sounds like something you'd enjoy. It's something you need. He was quiet. Then, they said the site you're investigating, that it's a town in Ohio, that people there have been getting sick. Yes, for how long? We think the contamination started around 2014. He didn't say anything for a moment. And if your case falls apart, those people don't get anything? That's how it works. The silence that followed was different from his usual silences. It wasn't the silence of someone waiting for the conversation to end. It was the silence of someone sitting with something for the first time. "I didn't think about any of that," he said finally. "I just saw the case and thought it looked like some kind of tech thing." "I know. I'm really sorry, Ivy." "I know," I said again. "Do the program." He did. The 30 hours were spread over 6 weeks. Field sessions took place at a remediation site 40 minutes outside the city where a team was extracting contaminated groundwater from a former manufacturing lot. Nate called me after the first one. He sounded different. Not chastened exactly. More like someone who'd just found out a room in a house he'd lived in his whole life was actually a lot bigger than he'd thought. "They showed us the monitoring wells," he said. "Like these tubes going into the ground to test what's in the water table. And the guy leading it said they find contamination sometimes that's been sitting there for 30 years. 30 years and nobody knew." "Sometimes they knew," I said. "That's the part we investigate." "That's insane. That's why the work matters." He went quiet again. I was starting to recognize this version of my brother, the one who showed up when the noise around him finally settled enough for something to get through. The classroom sessions were harder for him. He told me he'd always tuned out anything that felt like a lecture. He'd sit in the back of rooms and wait for it to be over. But something about the compliance program held him differently. Maybe it was the field sessions first. Maybe seeing what contamination actually looked like in soil, the discoloration, the smell, the way the guy from the remediation team talked about it with this flat, practiced neutrality. Like he described it so many times that it stopped shocking him. Maybe that made the classroom material land somewhere it wouldn't have before. He passed the assessments, all of them, on the first attempt. When he got his completion certificate, he texted me a photo of it. No message, just the photo. I stared at it for a second and then typed back. "Good." One word. But I meant it. The investigation wrapped 7 months later. I can't share details beyond what became public record, but the case held. The supplemental affidavit did its job. The evidence integrity review had flagged the incident and then cleared it, and that documentation actually strengthened our chain of custody argument in court because it showed exactly how rigorously every anomaly had been tracked and addressed. Nate read the press release the day it went out. He called me that evening. "It says the company's been ordered to fund remediation for 12 years, he said, and pay into a health monitoring trust. Yes, because of your investigation. Because of a lot of people's work. Mine included." A pause. I almost blew it. "Yes, but you reported it right away, so it didn't fall apart." Yes. He exhaled. I keep thinking about that. Like, if you had just come over yourself and grabbed it, I would have given it back. I would have laughed about it, and I never would have known any of the rest of it. The town in Ohio, the monitoring wells, none of it. I hadn't thought about it from that angle. Not quite like that, and you would have been in trouble, he added. Serious trouble. Potentially, yes. So you did the right thing for you and for the case. And you also, accidentally, made me do the 30 hours that I actually needed. I didn't do it for that reason. I know, he said. That's kind of the whole point. I didn't have an answer for that. For once, I didn't need one. A few months after the case closed, Nate and I had dinner. Real dinner. He cooked, which he was actually good at when he bothered. And we sat at his kitchen table with food that wasn't takeout and talked for 2 hours without either of us looking at our phones. He asked me questions about my work. Real questions. Not the polite nod kind, but the kind where he actually waited for the answer and then asked a follow-up. He wanted to know how contamination cases got opened, how sites got flagged, what happened to communities during the years between when contamination was discovered and when remediation actually started. At one point he said, I always thought you chose a boring job. Like environmental enforcement. It sounds like filing permits or something. Most people think that. It's not boring. No, you should have explained it better. I looked at him across the table. You should have asked. He nodded slowly, turning his fork over in his fingers. Yeah, I should have asked. He nodded slowly, turning his fingers aware. That was as close to a clean reckoning as we were going to get, and I knew it. My brother wasn't going to become a different person overnight. He was still going to be the one who filled a room with noise and borrowed things without asking, and believed that charm was a reasonable substitute for foresight. But there was something underneath all of that now. Something that hadn't been there before. A little more weight. A little more willingness to sit with something before deflecting. He never went through my bag again. Never borrowed anything without asking. And when I came to his place for dinner 3 months later, he mentioned that he'd been reading about a contamination case in the news somewhere in Michigan and wanted to know if I could explain the legal process behind what the plaintiffs were claiming. I stayed 2 hours longer than I'd planned. On the drive home, I thought about the morning his text came in. The cold coffee. The gray hoodie. The way my stomach had dropped when I read it. I thought about how close everything had come to unraveling. The case, my career, 8 months of work that connected directly to people who were still waiting for something to be made right. I'd made one call, done it by the book, let the system do what the system was designed to do. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the version of the story Nate would have told, where everything gets worked out over one uncomfortable conversation and then everybody hugs and moves on. It was paperwork and protocols and 6 days of not knowing if the thing I'd spent almost a year building was still standing. But it held. That's what people don't understand about the work I do. They see the rules and they think rigidity. They see the protocols and they think bureaucracy. They don't see what's on the other side of it. The town where the water ran wrong for years. The families who didn't know why their kids kept getting sick. The moment in a courtroom when the documentation is airtight and the case doesn't break. My brother borrowed something that didn't belong to him and thought it was harmless. In a lot of ways, that's the most human thing in the world. We all reach for things we want without thinking about what they're connected to, what they're part of, what breaks if they move. He knows better now. Not because I explained it. I tried to explain it for years. He knows because he had to stand in front of a federal coordinator and account for himself. Because he spent 6 weeks learning about the thing he'd casually treated as a prop. Because the world I lived in reached back and made him stand inside it for a while. I didn't do that for revenge. I didn't even do it to teach him a lesson. I did it because it was the only right thing to do. And the right thing happened to be the thing that finally got through. Sometimes that's how it works. You follow the rules not because it's easy, but because the rules are there for a reason, and the reason matters even when nobody's watching, even when the person who needs to understand it most is your own brother standing at a door in basketball shorts with his easy grin fading for the first time. The bracelet from my grandmother never came back. But something else did, eventually. Slowly, and with more paperwork than I expected, and probably only because I didn't try to keep it quiet. My brother finally understood what I do, and that turned out to be worth more than I knew how to say. I've thought a lot about what would have happened if I'd done it the other way. If I had grabbed my keys that morning, driven to Jess's building myself, knocked on the door with some excuse ready, taken the unit back, and just never mentioned it to anyone. Nate would have handed it over with that grin. We would have had an uncomfortable 10 minutes in the hallway. He would have said sorry in the easy way he always said sorry. Quickly, smoothly. Like someone who's had a lot of practice making apologies land without leaving a mark. And then it would have been over. No federal coordinator. No 30 hours of environmental compliance. No remediation site in the cold with monitoring wells going into contaminated ground. And somewhere in Ohio, the case would still be standing. Maybe. Or maybe not. I'll never know because I didn't take that road. What I know is this: every choice has a weight it carries forward. The choice to go through my bag wasn't malicious. I've made peace with that. Nate wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He just never learned to consider what he couldn't see. The device looked like a gadget. He wanted to impress someone. That's almost the most ordinary thing in the world. But ordinary thoughtlessness still has consequences. It doesn't get to be exempt just because the person behind it meant well. And my choice, to call my supervisor instead of handle it quietly, that carried weight forward too. 6 days of not knowing if the investigation held. A formal notice that rattled Nate in a way I never could have on my own. 30 hours of sitting with something he'd spent his whole life walking past. The moment he called me after his first field session and said, almost to himself, 30 years and nobody knew, that wouldn't have happened any other way. I didn't plan it. I didn't engineer it. I just did the right thing for the right reasons, and the right thing turned out to be bigger than I could see from where I was standing. That's the thing about integrity. It doesn't announce itself. It just holds, quietly under pressure, while everything around it tests whether it's real. I spent a long time being the sister who absorbed the imbalance, who was responsible so Nate didn't have to be, who explained things patiently and never made a scene and quietly accepted that this was just who we were to each other. I'm not angry about those years, not anymore, but I'm not willing to pretend they didn't shape me, or that the moment in that kitchen with my cold coffee was anything less than a decision about who I actually was. Intelligence without courage is just knowing what the right thing is, and doing nothing. Nate had always been smart. He was perceptive, funny, good at reading rooms. He just never had to apply any of it to something that cost him. The 30 hours cost him. The federal notice cost him. Not financially, not permanently, but in the way that matters most, in the currency of actual consequence. And something that costs you, really costs you, is the only thing that teaches you anything worth keeping. He knocked on my door at the end of all of it, brought food, sat across from me and asked real questions. That's the version of my brother I'd been waiting for without knowing I was waiting. I didn't get there by making things easier for him. I got there by refusing to.